Today I wanted to jump on and do a lens review of this lens I've been experimenting with for a few months now. This is the Tamron 35-150 F2-2.8. Now I bought this lens to replace my 24-70 and I really like it. My name is Mark Burgering. I'm a photographer and filmmaker and I do gear reviews here on YouTube like this lens. I would really appreciate it if you click the little subscribe button as a way of thanking me for the hard work that I put into these videos. So, onto the review. We're going to run through some specs, build and ergonomics, focus performance, image quality. I'll show you some sample photos and video. Then we're going to talk through some alternatives to this lens, and lastly, talk quickly about the value that I think it provides. So first up, I'm not going to run through all the specs, but you can look those up. But some of the interesting specs to me are the fact that this covers such a wide zoom range. So 35 is kind of a nice medium focal length. And then all the way out at 150 millimeters, you can get quite close. But the cool thing is that it's f2.8 throughout, but when you zoom back to 35 millimeters, it becomes an f2 lens, which is quite fast for that focal length. So at the 35 millimeter end, you're getting f2. As soon as you zoom just a little bit, it goes to f2.2 and then 2.8. So even though it's f2 to 2.8, you really only get f2 at the 35 millimeter end. Now this lens is a beast. It's 2.6 pounds, 1,165 grams. It's lighter than a 70-200 f2.8 from Sony, but it's heavier than the 70-200 f4. So it's kind of in between those two lenses if you have either of those to give you a sense for the feel of it. The other thing to know, this lens is $2,000 new. I picked it up for about $1,350 used on eBay, so that gives you a ballpark. All right, build and ergonomics. So this lens is obviously a beast. 2.6 pounds, as I mentioned, feels pretty heavy. And when you've got it on the end of your camera, you're definitely using a hand to support it. You're not holding one hand and balancing this whole lens. However, it's an excellent single lens setup. So if you don't need anything wider than 35 millimeters and you want to have that reach to zoom in on things that are far away, that 150 millimeters is really handy. So I find this to be far more flexible than a, say, 24-70, which 24 is nice and wide, but 70 is really not that telephoto. And when I'm filming things, I want to have a variety of shots. Same thing when I'm photographing. I want to have a variety of images. So having the flexibility to get something wide-ish at 35, and then zoom in real tight at, say, 100 or 135 or up to 150 millimeters is going to give you the flexibility to create focal length variety without having to change lenses. So this lens is somewhat plastic on the outside, but it's got some metal as well. It feels quite solid. I never really, I've been kind of banging it around for a few months now, and I've never felt like I was going to break it. It's quite full featured. It's got all the switches other than an aperture ring. It's got all the buttons and switches that you might expect. The AF/MF switch, this custom mode setting for how it does focus tracking. It's also got a USB port underneath this little piece of gaff tape that I have on here. Apparently you can plug it into your computer, download some software from Tamron, and customize it. I haven't really felt the need to do that because it's been working great as is, but it's kind of a fun thing you can do. Apparently this little port doesn't come with any caps or anything, so I just put a little piece of gaff tape on there to keep the dirt out. It is fully weather sealed, so you've got a nice O-ring around here. I've noticed that it is firm on the mount. It's not as smooth as some of my other lenses, but that does give me a little more confidence that this is actually providing a seal as opposed to some of my other lenses that don't feel quite as tight. I mentioned that I mostly shoot video with this lens because I like the simplicity of not having to swap lenses, but this lens is hefty to use. You're definitely not putting it on a gimbal with that level of extension. And so mostly I've been shooting it handheld with a little cage rig on my Sony a7S III, but I've really come to enjoy shooting with this lens because it's so flexible, gives me focal length variety, and it just, it's simple. Next, let's talk about focus performance. It's been focusing great. I haven't noticed any issues. It tracks really well, locks onto focus quickly. I don't have any complaints about it. It might not be as proficient as some of my GM, Sony G Master lenses, but it keeps up. It definitely is more performance than I initially expected. I've tried some other Tamron lenses in the past, haven't been too excited about them, but this one I'm pretty happy with. When it comes to image quality, I've been quite satisfied. I've mostly been shooting 4K video, but I've also shot quite a few photos with it, and they look quite sharp. You know, it's not like 50mm f1.2 jump off the page sharp, but it's definitely adequate. The compromise of having one lens that does so many different focal lengths is more important to me than having perfectly sharp or the best, highest image quality. Obviously, you make some sacrifices with a zoom lens, but I feel like this lens makes a good compromise. You know, it still gives you good quality while giving you a wide zoom range. With that said, let's take a look at some sample images and video. You'll see a variety of focal lengths, and you can see that it's quite sharp throughout the focal range, even, you know, from 35mm all the way down to 150mm. When it comes to alternatives to this lens, it's in kind of a unique position. There's not very many lenses that have such a wide zoom range that have such a low aperture. 35mm f2, 150mm f2.8. That's not a huge difference in exposure, which I appreciate. Sometimes you'll get a zoom lens, say the 28-200. By the time you zoom all the way out to 200, you're at f5.6, which, you know, that's a significant reduction in light between 28 and 200. As I mentioned, I went away from the 24-70 because it just didn't quite have the same focal length variety. 24-70 is a great lens, but when it comes to shooting video, I like to have a little bit more reach. I like to get in tighter. So that's why I wanted something with a longer maximum focal length. You might look at the 24-105 from Sony. That's a solid lens, but it's only f4. So it's, you know, a full stop slower than this lens. So you're gonna get less low light performance. You know, at 35mm, I can shoot, at f2, I can shoot in pretty dark conditions that aren't conducive to shooting on an f4 lens. It's a pretty significant difference. So because of all those factors, this is a pretty unique lens, and I've really been enjoying it. Now there is another version, I think it's, you know, sort of a knockoff from Samyang or Rokinon, the same exact specs. I haven't tried that lens personally, but the reason I didn't buy it was because I couldn't find a copy on eBay. So the Tamron is more readily accessible. The Rokinon or Samyang version, less expensive, but I am not sure about the quality sacrifices that it makes. So with all those features considered, this is a great value lens, I think. You know, even $2,000 new, around $1,300 to $1,400 used, you're getting a huge variety in focal length. You know, to cover this same range would be several prime lenses. Getting all those with a relatively fast aperture, I think makes this lens an excellent value. So if you want kind of an all-in-one lens where you never have to change lenses during the day, this is a great option, which in turn makes it a great value. So that's it for my review of the Tamron 35-150. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments, and thanks so much for watching.